oral questions. Question orale. Honorable député.
The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. Mr. Speaker, for the Conservatives, the rights of victims should always take precedence over the rights of criminals. On Friday, the Supreme Court rendered a disappointing verdict that will allow violent criminals, serial killers like Alexandre Bissonnette and Justin Bourque to walk the streets again, despite life sentences. They murdered 9 people, Mr. Speaker. The victims will never be able to walk the streets with members of their family. Will the Prime Minister commit to doing everything to ensure that the perpetrators of mass shootings serve sentences commensurate with the crimes they commit? The Honourable Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, we recognize the pain that has been caused to the families, particularly within that community in Quebec, but also the community across Canada. We must remember, Mr. Speaker, that the fact that they are eligible for parole does not mean that they will be given parole. The Parole Board of Canada will determine whether Alexandre Bissonnette, like any other sentenced murderer serving time, will be eligible, in fact, to get parole. We respect this clear and unanimous decision made by the Supreme Court of Canada. The court clearly indicated that it was a cruel and unusual punishment. The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. In 2015, the Prime Minister promised to make life more affordable for everyone. 7 years later, here's the report card. Gas costs twice as much. House prices have doubled. Groceries cost a fortune. Inflation has gone from 1.1% to 6.8%. And with the carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, the government itself is taking money from the pockets of Canadians. The facts speak for themselves. Under the Liberals, more and more Canadians cannot pay their bills. What is the Prime Minister going to do to help the middle class and those who are paying more and more money to stay in it? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we understand, as do all Canadians, that inflation is a global phenomenon, but we also understand that this is causing trouble and suffering for Canadian families. That is why our government has taken action. Our budget includes concrete measures like dental care for Canadians, a one-time $500 payment for people having access to housing issues, the implementation of a tax credit for renovating multi-generational housing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. A lot of nothing. The government's responses to inflation, rising gas prices, rising food prices and housing prices, severely lacking in compassion for Canadians, and it's comparing ourselves to other countries is not the way to help families struggling to make ends meet at the end of each month. The government is one of the biggest beneficiaries of inflation because it's collecting more and more taxes from Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Instead of continuing to fill its coffers on the backs of everyone else, will the Prime Minister give some respite to Canadians and lower taxes? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, we have no lessons to learn from the Conservatives when it comes to helping Canadians, the most vulnerable Canadians. We put in place benefits that have allowed Canadians with children to have more money. We have also helped many people who are seniors. We are helping vulnerable Canadians, and we will continue to do that.
Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Speaker, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia are all acting on high gas prices. Even Germany slashed its fuel tax by $16 billion. Our Canadian government, zip, zero, nothing, nada. Conservatives proposed exempting GST from fuel to give Canadians a break at the pumps, but the SPENDP Liberals voted against it. Will this Prime Minister take a cue from other G7 leaders and start acting on high gas prices, or is the only acting that he enjoys doing these days is playing a Prime Minister on TV?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we understand understand that inflation is a global phenomenon. We understand that it is very much driven today by Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, and that is why we are so active on that issue. But we also understand it is causing real hardship for Canadian families, and that's why our government has acted. We created the CCB, which is indexed to inflation, and now a single mother with 2 children will receive up to $13,666 from this benefit. OAS indexed to inflation going up by 10% this year, and of course, early learning and childcare, Mr. Speaker.
Bravo. The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
More recycled talking points aren't going to help people on low income due to inflation. Nearly half of all Canadians say skyrocketing grocery bills are making it impossible to feed their families, and food banks are at a breaking point. Economists say inflation started in meat products, but now it's broadened to the most common food items due to rising gas prices. Will the Spend EP Liberals cut taxes at the pumps to help curb grocery inflation, or was it their plan all along, Mr. Speaker, to simply pass it on, the burden, to food banks?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance.
You know, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the most vulnerable Canadians, precisely the people who need to rely on food banks, we will take absolutely no lessons from the Conservatives when it comes to supporting them. In 2015, when we formed government, more than 5.1 million Canadians lived in poverty. In 2019, the last year for which we have figures, that number had dropped to below 3.8 million. We have programs indexed to inflation, supporting the most vulnerable, and there's more support in the budget, Mr. Speaker.